Hello, I'm William Law, and you're listening to the Arab Digest podcast. My guest today is Helen Lackner. Helen is a Yemen expert and a regular contributor to the Arab Digest newsletter and to our podcast. She's the author of several books on the country. Her latest, published by Routledge, is titled Yemen, Poverty and Conflict. I recommend it highly. Helen, welcome back to the podcast.
Well, thank you very much for bringing me back and also for keeping the listeners interested in Yemen.
Well, we're going to look at Yemen in detail in the podcast, but first of all, can I just have your reaction to the Trump-Gaza deal?
Yes, I've been finding appropriate vocabulary to deal with this. It's something I find, very difficult. I mean, this so-called ceasefire has now been going on for 11 days. I think something like 100 people have already been killed by the Israelis in Gaza during this period. There's absolutely no clarity as to ever reaching a second phase, as they say. It sounds to me like a farce theater. It's largely unrelated to reality. I mean, the suggestions that, something positive is likely to come out of it is really difficult to imagine. The only good point, which I think is incredibly important for the people in Gaza, of course, is that now for 11 days they have not been systematically bombed, massacred, and attacked by all kinds of weaponry and had their buildings destroyed and all the remaining buildings, the few buildings that are still standing, destroyed. So it's very difficult to be in any way positive, except for this unbelievably important element that people are not being killed or not, and the situation, the destruction is not continuing. Though when you look at the pictures of Gaza, it's very difficult to see what more can be destroyed. I mean, it's just extraordinary when you see a building that's actually not totally destroyed.
Yes, one of the things that I've observed is this seeming ability of Israel to walk away from the genocide. No one's talking about the genocide that Israel has committed on the Palestinians.
Indeed, no one's talking about the genocide and no one's talking about what's going to happen next or any future for, Palestine and Palestinians. The main thing is that it's completely remote from reality and from the past, the present, or indeed the future.
Yeah.
And they talk about reconstruction, they talk about presumably contracts, they talk about all these things, but how can anybody, regardless of whether it's Palestinians or Trump's crazy Riviera project, how are they going to live on this land which has millions and millions of tons of rubble, which has probably tons of unexploded ammunition of the chemical remnants of the exploded ammunition, the chemical pollution, and let alone the corpses that are buried underneath this of, humans and animals and everything else. I mean, it has been turned into an unlivable area. And it strikes me that, the idea of anybody being able to live there or rebuild is beyond human capacity today, I would say,
Yeah.
technologically and physically.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, and again, here is Trump and others threatening the Palestinians with the gates of hell. Well, I mean, they've been inside hell now for more than 2 years. Where do the gates come into this?
Mhm.
I find the whole thing is, and as you said, the complete proposed impunity of Israel on this, and the fact that, I mean, the latest I heard was that, Trump's giving Hamas another chance for what, while the Israelis are still killing people
Yeah.
and still destroying and still, and nothing has been said about the Israeli statements on multiple occasions that under no conditions will they allow any kind of Palestinian state. So where is the future for this? I find this, it just seems to be taking place at a level of imagination that's outside, totally unrelated to the real world.
Yeah. Well, look, presumably with the ceasefire, the Houthis, because we're now going to talk about Yemen, will stand down from lobbing missiles and drones into the Red Sea and at Israel. But beyond that, what does the deal mean for the Houthis? I guess is my question.
Well, I mean, they have stood down and they have said that they are watching, the situation very closely. And, they have stuck to what they'd always said, which is that they will stop attacks if the situation in Palestine improves. So, they have done this, and a lot of people are saying they're waiting for an opportunity to start again. And I think there's some truth to that, particularly since at the time when the involvement in Gaza started, i.e., just almost 2 years ago in November 2023, they were in a situation where their position was seriously weakened. And they were about to sign a deal with the Saudis, which would have been a very positive one for them, and indeed for the Saudis. But otherwise, they were, in trouble internally because their popularity level had sunk very low, and all the different problems of their rule continued to operate and still continue to operate. So, in a way, the Gaza war was a godsend for them because it gave them the opportunity of improving their public relations image immensely. I mean, as we all know and we all said, if you'd mentioned the Houthis to an average person demonstrating on Palestine 2 years ago, they would have said, "What is it?" They wouldn't even have said, "Who are they?" And now you read, particularly in the ultra-left press, endless praise of the Houthis as the one and only group that are fighting Israel and that are supporting the Palestinians. So they've developed not only a very considerable improved public relations at the world level, but also within Yemen. In Yemen, it is very difficult to find anyone who would not support Palestinians. So, in a way, this has given them, 2 years of very, very changed position in terms of their popularity. And this is really a very important point because it's it's really helped them to maintain their rule during this period. And so ending this, which I think one has to be extremely skeptical because is it ended? Will it start again? And many people's views is that the Gaza war will restart in no time at all. So assuming that it does end, again, a very big assumption, the Houthis fall back to the position they were in 2 years ago, which is that their popularity is much lower. The economic condition, living conditions, etc., are very seriously deteriorated in the area that they control. And there's no obvious answer, no obvious solution to the problem other than returning to the discussions for peace that were taking place in 2023. Yeah, and that is, quite different. I mean, the environment today is quite different for that in many ways.
Mhm. Do you think there's a possibility that the U.S. and or Israel will conduct more missile strikes against the Houthis? Is that still in the cards?
Yes, yes and no. I mean, I don't think the US will attack again. I think the failure of the operation of that 52-day attack series in March, April this year was a difficult situation for Trump. And now that he stopped it, and the fact that many of them, his military and serious people in the US don't want this to happen and are worried about the depletion of the weaponry in the Pacific and elsewhere. So I don't think the US will start strikes again. It's also notable that although the strikes had some impact, their impact was very limited. On the other hand, I think it's almost certain that Israel will start striking again, and sooner rather than later. I
Mhm.
mean, the Israelis are, as I think somebody put it, unhinged and totally out of control. and they feel, they've finished off all the other supposed proxies of Iran. And now they will go for Yemen, particularly if the US prevents them from attacking Iran directly. So I think the likelihood of them turning their attention to Yemen in a more serious way is very high.
Mm.
It's also important to remember that until this happened, the Israelis' knowledge of the situation in Yemen was fairly weak, and it wasn't particularly an area of priority for them. Now, this situation has changed considerably. I mean, since July, they created a specific unit, to gather intelligence on Yemen. They have a multiplicity of sources. I mean, other than all the, cyber sources that exist, they also get some human intelligence, not necessarily directly, but certainly they can get it indirectly via the contacts of their friends in the UAE on the ground. They have actually achieved something already in the fighting, in the sense that, the killings of the main civilian government of the Houthis was not a major threat to the Houthi entity, in the sense that the government is not really the source of power, the source of influence within the Houthi system. But they also did manage to kill a number of senior military and intelligence officers. And it's interesting that the main one was the chief of staff, Al-Ramari, who was probably wounded in June, I think. Then there was the first attack on him. Has now been, the Houthis have now, in the last week, admitted that he had been killed. And more likely than not, he died more recently of his wounds. So the Israelis have already had some successes in hitting the leadership. And of course, the Houthis are all the more cautious. But although I think it's unlikely that the Israelis would succeed in massacring the top leadership of the Houthis in the way they did in Hezbollah, I think that they certainly may well manage to do some more damage to the Houthi leadership in the coming weeks and months. And I think at the slightest excuse, or possibly even without an excuse, I would not be at all surprised if they start attacking again.
Let me ask you now about the FTO, the Foreign Terrorist Organization designation on Ansar Allah, the Houthis that Trump announced back in January. Is that now starting to bite? Is that now starting to hit the Houthi economy?
Yes, I think it's important to look at the FTO within the overall context of the economy. On its own, it doesn't achieve that much, but combined with all the other elements of the deterioration of the economy and the deteriorating control of the Houthis over the financial system, it's playing an important role. And the main thing it's having is that it's basically enabled the internationally recognized government to take control of the banks, something that they tried to do in 2024. And in 2024, when they sent the orders for the banks to all move their headquarters to Aden and away from Sana'a, the Houthis basically told the Saudis that they better make sure this ends, otherwise they would attack Saudi. And the Saudis told the government to forget about it. And the government promptly cancelled or basically ignored that order. Now, thanks to the FTO, they have been able to achieve this transfer of most of the bank's headquarters from Sana'a to Aden. And that means that Aden has more control over the banking system. And that has a big impact both on trade and, of course, on remittances and on the difficulties for people to transfer money and to operate financially. So I would say that that is the main impact of the FTO, which is something that is gradually becoming more noticeable. And that operates alongside all the other measures which are really beginning to bite on the Houthis in general.
So, what are some of the other economic challenges that the Houthis are facing, Helen? And we should just remind our listeners that two-thirds of the Yemeni population are under Houthi control, and that's roughly what, 23 million people, feeling the impact of a besieged and faltering economy.
I mean, the fact is that, the economy has been weakened and weakened and weakened and weakened over the years, and there's less and less and less resources, and trade is becoming more and more difficult. The destruction, and combined with more of a blockade of the ports, is preventing imports. And let's remember that about 90% of basic staple foods, i.e. wheat and rice and tea and sugar and such like, are imported in Yemen. And of course, people's financial capacity to buy anything is constantly reduced. So although everything is available in the supermarkets, or so I'm told, including Saudi products, available in the Sana supermarkets, at the same time, it's very, very difficult for most people to buy these things because they haven't got any salaries, they haven't been paid, and the informal sector is very much weakened, and agriculture has suffered from endless droughts and floods. So you have, basically an overall worsening of the situation. And of course, the cutting or the almost cancellation of humanitarian assistance in the Houthi areas is having a massive, massive impact. You had, 17 to 18 million people throughout Yemen who were almost exclusively dependent on food and financial handouts from the aid system, and that has not, that's basically stopped in the Houthi-controlled areas, in other words, for the majority of the population. And one more element, which is not economic, but it's relevant to the situation of the Houthis, is that the interception of weapons and munitions, etc., coming from abroad has increased considerably in the last few months, both from the internationally recognized government and other forces. And so this is really weakening them. And my feeling at the moment is that we may have reached a point where from now on the Houthis are going to be gradually weakened. And I think that's an important element to note, but it's also not going to be an overnight transformation of this situation.
You're listening to the Arab Digest podcast with me, William Law, and the Yemen specialist, Helen Lackner. As well as the podcast, Arab Digest has a daily newsletter. Why not make it your go-to source for independent analysis and fresh insights into the Middle East, North Africa? Head to our website, arabdigest.org, for details on how to get the newsletter for 2 months for free. Check us out at arabdigest.org. I wanted now, Helen, just to talk about, and you've mentioned them, the key outside players, Saudi Arabia and the UAE. We know the Saudis are desperate to get out, but what about the UAE? What are the Emiratis up to? Are they, still big players in the difficult situation that Yemenis face?
Yes, I think, reassert what you just said, which is that the Saudis do want out. And I think there's, in that sense, there's a reasonable likelihood that they will try again to make an agreement with the Houthis. Though, of course, they are also noticing that the Houthis are on the verge of becoming, I'd say on the verge of becoming significantly weaker. I wouldn't say it's already started. And therefore, that may be a reason for them to delay things. But on that one, I think we'll see what happens in the new attempts of the UN Special Envoy to restart negotiations and restart discussions, and see if the situation develops in a different way from the way it did in 2023. I think for the Emiratis, there is absolutely no doubt to me that they continue to be deeply involved. The big difference is that they're not involved directly in the sense that they don't have that many troops in Yemen, but they are involved much more actively through their, let's put it, their agents or their allies. I don't like to use the word proxies. And they vary. I mean, there's a number of them, and they're primarily one particular faction of the Southern Separatist Front. And that particular faction of southern separatists, led by Aidaus al-Zubaydi, are the ones who have actually stated that they're looking forward to signing the Abraham Accords and hope to join the UAE in that type of approach, and certainly to work with Israel. And whether those people are also participating in some way or other in passing on information to Israel about whatever they might know, because they are very focused on the south and they definitely have very few contacts in the Houthi-controlled area. But, something may be happening there. So the UAE are deeply involved. It seems to me, in my view, at this point, that the UAE's prime objective is to prevent the Saudis from reaching a solution. I think if you look also at what they're doing in Sudan, if you look at what they're doing elsewhere, you can see that they're actively preventing the Saudis from achieving whatever it is they want to achieve. In the case of Yemen, I think would be some kind of agreement with some kind of government. I think a parenthesis to this needs to be added, which is the new prime minister in Aden is actually trying to take some action which will improve the governance in the area that they control. But he hasn't yet succeeded. And I think the farcical situation of the so-called interim government, interim capital of Aden having power cuts of 22 hours per day. And this has now been going on for ages, is a symptom of the ineffectiveness of this government.
The internationally recognized government, hopelessly fractured and based in the southern city of Aden.
And again, it's important to look at not just Aden, but the rest of the area and the divisions that are happening within this internationally recognized government, which are, on that one, the UAE are supporting different factions with different views. So in a sense, they're contributing to the fragmentation. They're not just supporting the southern separatists, they're also supporting factions which are not separatist. And even amongst the separatists, they're supporting different factions. So that the clashes and the tensions between these factions continue and develop. As a result, the overall situation of the internationally recognized government is, I'd say, more fragmented today than it was since it's been created, or since the Presidential Leadership Council was created in April 2022.
Mm.
It really is a situation where it seems to me that the UAE's primary the reality of what they're doing, whether it's their final objective or it's what they're doing, is to ensure continued fragmentation and weakness of this internationally recognized government and therefore its inability to confront the Houthis and therefore
Yeah,
worsening the instability in the country.
yeah. And once again, leaving the Yemeni people in a terribly difficult situation. So we have this picture, the opposition to the Houthis hopelessly fragmented, the Emiratis up to no good, the Saudis desperately trying to get a peace deal done, but being blocked effectively by the Emiratis. And the Houthis themselves, as you point out, weaken in a weakened state. So what then does the future hold for Yemen, Helen?
I think in the short term, I mean, as you pointed out, and I think it's always worth repeating it, millions of Yemenis are suffering from the complete lack of consciousness of humanity of their political leaders who are ready to basically let them starve and let them suffer endlessly just to further their own personal objectives. And I think that's always worth repeating. I think in the longer run, I think we're looking at the beginning of the weakening of the Houthis. This does mean that should there be a much more effective anti-Houthi group, the trend, the move might change. Things might go in a direction towards an end of the Houthis. But as long as the instability is maintained on the side of the internationally recognized government, it's going to be very difficult to achieve anything. So I would suspect that for the next year or two, we will see more of what we're seeing at the moment, until and unless the situation changes within the internationally recognized government. And that would mean having a united front between the Emiratis and the Saudis that would create a government that would be effective and that would be able to engage the Houthis either in negotiations or even militarily. I don't see this happening in the immediate future, but it's a possibility. And
Mm.
as you know, and as I've said before, a prediction is not really my line.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting point you make that were the Saudis and the Emiratis to agree to work together and reconstitute a government, an effective opposition to the Houthis, with the Houthis being in a weakened position, they might then come to some sort of deal. We'll just have to wait and see. But Helen, thanks so much for talking with me today.
Well, thank you for bringing Yemen up to again to the attention of a few people. We hope even a few more. And I think anybody, who has the opportunity to help in any way in terms of the humanitarian situation of the way the Yemenis are suffering, they should please do what they can. Thank you.
And thank you. You've been listening to the Arab Digest podcast. My guest today was the Yemen expert, Helen Lackner. The Middle East is the single most important story in the world today, and getting a grip on it has never been more important. That's what Arab Digest does, week in, week out, with the podcast and our daily newsletter. Here at the Digest, we have a team of analysts, commentators, and writers, contributors like Helen, providing acute insights and fresh perspectives you're not going to find anywhere else. And here's something else to think about. Independent journalism is under intense pressure. Here at Arab Digest, we are an independent voice. No sponsors and no advertising. Our funding comes only from our subscribers. If you'd like to support that independent voice and plug into everything Arab Digest has to offer, and that includes the daily newsletter, head to our website at arabdigest.org, where we have a free 2-month trial to the newsletter on offer. Follow us on Facebook, X, and LinkedIn, and search our library of more than 300 podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, or other platforms. Thank you for listening. I'm William Law, editor of the Arab Digest. Essential reading, essential listening from independent sources.